I think there are two approaches, like in the business world, on where it's going. One approach is that there's going to be one AI to rule them all that will do everything, like OpenAI will take over, the world in that sense. And the other school of thought says that you will have like this generic AI, but if you want to have a problem solved very well with AI, then it needs to be specialized. It needs to solve that problem. And there are specific verticals or specific problems like ours where without the data or the specific vertical data that is not available to, for example, the big language models, because it's data that is of the right distribution for the right users and the right use case, that without it's impossible to solve that problem.
And welcome into another episode of the 100-Year Podcast. My name is Dario Strange, and this week we have with us Roy Mor, the CEO and co-founder of Loora.ai. How you doing, Roy?
Good. It's great to be here, Dario, and thank you for inviting me.
Thanks for joining us. Just to cut straight to the chase, Loora is, I guess you would call it kind of like an artificial intelligence, I guess, English tutor or English companion.
Yeah, I would call it an English tutor, which is in many cases an English companion, right? Because it's a very long journey to become fluent in English for so many people all over the world. And I think the biggest hurdle is that you have no one to talk to. And you don't need just to talk about ordering something, in a restaurant or making your own around the airport. You need to talk about what people really talk in their lives. Building meaningful relationships, talking about tech, talking about business, talking about whatever is interesting to them. And you need someone to actually talk to and get feedback. And that's what we do, kind of replacing the human tutor so anyone in the world can overcome this barrier that English fluency poses.
So one of the reasons you guys came up on my radar is I'm kind of like a lifelong language learner. I previously lived in Japan. When I first moved
Nice.
there, I studied in Japanese school, and I still have like a stack of Japanese translation books, dictionaries,
Well,
Japanese grammar books. I used all of the software, and I think most people out there will, probably know of Duolingo.
of
Um,
course.
but there's also kind of like tools like or online platforms called iTalki. I don't know if you've heard about that.
Yeah, italki, Preply, Cambly, like a marketplace for language tutors.
Right. But
Yeah,
the thing is, it's like, and this is kind of like, I don't think this is unique to me. It's just, when you're studying language, particularly something that's very far from your kind of like native language, it's kind of embarrassing. It's kind
it
of,
is.
there's a lot of, you have to really build up your confidence.
Right.
And particularly if you're in a different country, people say, oh, immerse yourself. But what people don't understand is, like, if you're an expat in somewhere in Asia, you often naturally gravitate toward people who speak your native language. So I found myself, after Japanese school, we'd go out for beers. And instead of like immersing myself in Japanese, I'd find myself with a bunch of other foreigners and we're all speaking English. And so the
Right.
reason why I was fascinated by Loora is that it was this idea of harnessing kind of like the emerging powers of AI to finally give you this kind of, I guess, embarrassment-free zone where you can
Right.
basically just, to your heart's content,
Be
basically
yourself.
just make all the mistakes, figure out
Right.
all the, the foibles or whatever. And so the first thing I'm wondering is, like, why just English now? Like, that for me, it was frustrating because I was like, this is a brilliant idea, but just English? Like, what? Like, can you,
So
like, what's behind that?
it's a great question. So as I told you before the interview, like the name Lura came from another language. Lura is actually language in Arabic. And when we started, my frustration, because my English is okay, my
I think
frustration
your
wasn't,
English is pretty damn good. Okay.
it's okay for, yeah, not for an American, but for a non-American, it's okay. Um, and, um, but I was really frustrated with learning a lot of languages including English, because I didn't have anyone. I don't live in the United States, and I didn't have anyone to speak English with. I was just reading, and as time goes on, your accent goes away, and it becomes harder and harder to be yourself in the language and to express yourself. And you go on to talk to someone, and you just feel stupid or embarrassed, and it's not a great feeling. And the only way to get over it is to actually practice speaking on the things that you're interested in or that you work on. But I was also frustrated, so I was learning Spanish at the time, and I used to do sales in Spanish, like enterprise sales, and I was pretty good. And now I can barely have a basic conversation because it just goes away. And although Duolingo is such an amazing company, really one of the best companies out there, and with a great mission, it mostly caters to casual learners and people who kind of want to learn a language as a hobby and get from zero to a little bit. But if you really want to work in a language or actually, make friends and be yourself in a language, it's just not the solution because you have to speak the language. Um, so it didn't help me with Spanish, and I was learning French at the time, and it was the same problem. And I was learning Arabic at the time as a hobby, and like I did all the courses in all the apps, and I didn't have time to go to a tutor. But then when I met someone in the street, like I couldn't even string like two sentences together because it's very different to actually have a conversation. And out of that frustration, we said, wouldn't it be amazing if you just had like your own personal AI tutor in your pocket who you can just talk to whenever you want? How about whatever you want? And you're not feeling attacked. And if you don't know what to say, you can stop and think. Uh, and that way anyone can kind of overcome this major barrier, because as you said, it's hard to learn a language. And even for immigrants in the US, who you say they can just speak English to American people, right? But they're embarrassed and they feel like they're not speaking well enough, or they don't have around them people who they can speak to, or even if they do, they feel more comfortable, or it's easier for them after a hard day to go and speak with someone in their own language. um, so I really identify with, or kind of empathize with the situation you had in Japan. And I think the only solution to go through is an immersion that is not as hard, like an immersion that allows you to be yourself, but also, you know, not to make that much of an effort and to make mistakes and not to be embarrassed about it. And that was kind of the driving idea behind starting Loora. When we started Loora, which was 2020 or late 2020, and I was just doing my PhD, and which we can talk about later, in open domain dialogue or free conversation, the main issue was maybe it's impossible to build. Like the generative AI revolution didn't come yet. So it was clear for people in academia that it's coming, or people in academia who worked on that problem, but it wasn't clear that you can build something like that can allow people to be engaged and entertained and evolve and adapt, and talk about like more and more complicated things and as they progress, in order to actually learn English to the level of fluency that they need. And to get back to your original question, why just English? So, because I forgot the question. I'm sorry.
No, no, you came back. You came back.
I think there, if I crudely divide the language learning audiences into two audiences, two groups. One group is people who learn languages as a hobby, like I learn Spanish, like you learn Japanese, and they don't necessarily expect to reach a very high level of fluency. Um, and they learn a lot of languages, usually not English, and they learn it in order to be able to travel to a country, in order to be able to, say a few phrases, to, do cognitive training, or just as a hobby. Um, but they don't need it as a way to actually improve their lives. The other group is people who are struggling and they need to know English, because English is, the global language thing. Without English, it's very hard. In the US and outside of the US, it's very hard to reach your goals and improve your life, both professionally and personally. And they usually already kind of know basic English and they can have a basic conversation, but they need to reach a level where they feel like themselves in English and they can be as smart as they are in, whether it be Spanish or Portuguese or Arabic or, Chinese, in English. And they can do business and they can work and they can find better opportunities. And they need a different product, because this product is a longer journey. Uh, it's more difficult or more complex conversations that you need to have. The feedback is more nuanced, and it's just a different product. Um,
that's interesting. You talk about nuance. I was kind of like looking at the entire universe of kind of the examples that you give and everything, and I noticed like you do spend a good deal of time talking about kind of cultural, I guess, code language. I remember there was one thing you talked about ghosting, not you, but there's like one video I was watching, kind of like you talked about what ghosting means in English, like little kind of like cultural phrases.
yeah,
Yeah, so that kind of nuance is important. I'm curious, like what? So the target language is English in terms of practice. What,
right.
like, what's the list of like how many languages can I speak to it in? Oh well, actually,
And
that's not.
it's a
How many
close language.
languages does it is it aware of in terms of my, I guess, mistakes? Meaning, if I speak Hindi and there mistakes, I'm assuming there are mistakes common to.
Typical mistakes for Hindi speakers.
Right. So is
Yeah.
that
So we are working to improve it all the time. To be honest, because we're targeting people who already know some basic English, as opposed to people who don't know anything, then the product experience is in English. So you can translate anything and everything that there is in the app, and you can have like lifelines. If you don't know what to say, you can get a suggestion, or you can look up a word or translate what Laura said, and get like lifelines in your own language, and that's almost every language. I think maybe we're missing a few. Um, but the actual conversation is in English. With regarding to the feedback, then we are learning for each audience, and we're better at the audiences where we have more users. What are the typical mistakes, and then we can help with them. But we can do a much better job at that. Like we're not perfect there; it's hard to do, and we need more data. And the more and more data we have, the better we'll learn what feedback to give
you
and
know?
what type of typical mistakes people make.
Yeah, well, in my own testing of the app, it was I actually had trouble tripping it up. I had to like really
Yeah,
try to like dirty up my own English and like I mean
right.
it was pretty good. And then, I slowly began to figure out, okay, what kind of mistakes to make to get it to,
To
give
give
me
you
the
feedback.
responses and
Yeah.
kind of like the testing, the proof of uh function that I was looking for. Um I want to rewind though. Let's talk about you for a second.
Sure.
This isn't like your first, I guess, foray into AI. I mean, you're a computer engineer.
Yeah.
You've been studying machine learning for quite some time. I know you got your master's a few years ago. You just mentioned something about a PhD. I know you
Yeah.
studied at Tel Aviv University. Did you
Yeah.
complete your PhD recently, or are you still
No, I
engaged?
no, I dropped out very quickly to start Lura.
Okay,
Um,
okay.
yeah, so I can give you like the usual spiel
Oh
from
yeah,
the
yeah.
beginning.
Well, tell us
Yeah.
about it. Yeah.
So born in Jerusalem, but now in Tel Aviv. 38, married to Maya, who's an amazing award-winning film producer, won the Israeli Oscar, and much more talented than me. And I have a 3-year-old son who is a menace. Um, and I founded Lura with my best friends for 20 years now, which means we're very old already. About 3 years ago. Um, I found my way into AI by mistake. I started learning physics. So I did 2 bachelor degrees. I have a bachelor degree in physics and I have another bachelor degree in electrical engineering. And during my studies, what I found out is what I'm interested most in is what they now call machine learning. I didn't know it was what it's called, but prediction and estimation and learning how to kind of do AI in a sense. So we started, both of us, me and my co-founder Jonathan, to learn on our own. We found a professor who will kind of advise us, and then we looked for a place to work where we can actually do research during our undergrad studies. I went to work for Mobileye, which is an autonomous vehicle company, um, a great company, and I got to do research and build, like, help. It's not here yet, but help build autonomous vehicles. And then I went back to university for Mobileye. I did my master's in computer science this time. I focused both on theory and on what they call in academia open domain dialogue, which is open conversation, which is kind of what we do now. Continued to my PhD and dropped out like a month or two after I started in order to start Lura, because I understood I want to build something and not just, although I really love mathematics, I want to build and not just write papers.
Gotcha. And can you Like, my understanding is that Google got involved with Tel Aviv University not that long
Yeah.
ago in terms of funding. Did that have any impact on you and your studies? Were you able to kind of get some insight into what they were doing?
So my advisor was and still working at Google, actually. I think working on similar topics because everyone is working on those topics. And a lot of our professors were working at Google or at the Allen Institute. Uh, so yeah, in a sense, and they got a lot of grants to work on AI. So we had a lot of NVIDIA GPUs, so we could train a lot of models. So in that sense, yeah. Me myself, I didn't work at Google because I worked with Mobileye. Um, but yeah, I think in general there was in Israel pretty early on a sense that AI is super important. And in Tel Aviv University, they started bringing in a lot of professors for AI or machine learning, as we called it, um, because there was a shortage. A lot of people wanted to learn it. There were not enough professors. Um, and I think in Israel we're mostly strong in theory. Um, and then the money from companies like Google and other companies who contribute to the university allowed us also to do empirical studies like training models and do stuff they usually do in industry.
So I've spoken about Israel and AI, or we've spoken about it here before. One of our previous guests was Roni Abovitz, the founder
Yeah,
of Magic Leap,
yeah,
and it's interesting. You know, Israel has been very strong in computer vision and AI and machine learning for some time. And a few episodes ago, we noted that, like, among like the top four nations around the world, Israel, as like this tiny nation, seems to be, it's like ranked in that top tier. So I mean, what is it that you like? What would you attribute that to? Why do you think Israel is so, I guess, punching above its weight in terms of like I guess, experts, research, study?
yeah. So I don't think it necessarily has something to do with AI specifically. I think it has to do with Israel punching above its weight in the startup ecosystem in general. Like when you think about startup hubs or kind of where startups really work and a lot of companies, big companies, start out of, Israel or Tel Aviv specifically is one of the top places in the world, which is really surprising because it's a very small place and there are not a lot of people. Um, but there's something about the society and the spirit in Israel which is very entrepreneurial, like not rigid, not bound by rules. I would say maybe a little kind of arrogant, even in a sense. In Hebrew, we say chutzpah, kind of dares to try stuff that are not necessarily obvious or maybe not within the confines of what you're expected to do. Um, and it became a thing like that. A lot of Israelis just go out and they start companies. They don't want to work at the place. They don't want to be um, live a riskless life. They want to take risks. They want to build stuff. Um, and I would say it's really part of the structure of society here, which is really nice. And there's a very, or maybe an incredible, even amazing ecosystem for startups in Israel. Me as a young in experience, not young in age, but young, uh, entrepreneur, I can just approach anyone in the ecosystem and they'll help me and they'll talk to me and they'll like guide me on what to do. Founders of companies like Lightrix who invested in us, or Simply Simply Piano and teaches music is a very similar company. They're always helpful. Uh, any
Yeah,
big company, you can just get in
I,
touch with like the CEO and they'll help you, and that's amazing.
I should mention you guys just landed, I guess, last July, 9.25 million in funding.
Yeah,
Is that right? Yeah. So that, I mean, doing that outside of Silicon Valley is like, again, that's notable, and I think that's another reason why Israel, in terms of AI, machine learning, computer
right.
vision, is on my.
The VC ecosystem here is, I would say, getting. It's not Silicon Valley, but it's getting closer and closer. And a lot of big VCs opened offices in Israel. So Insight, they have a big office in Israel, um, and they are aware of what's happening in the Israeli ecosystem, and that helps a lot. So raising money out of Israel is not a struggle, as in other places or outside of Silicon Valley, which also helps. And in addition, I would say that academia in Israel is also very strong or has always been very strong, especially in theory. Um, but then AI, there are strong mathematical. There's a strong mathematical basis and like a strong theoretical basis that is required to kind of that was required to kind of start the revolution that we're in now. And I think a lot of people in Israel had a lot of experience in that area. So academically, they're also relatively strong to to the size of the country,
So
and that also helps.
so take me back to the app. Like when I use the app, it seems like it's mostly driven by, well, not mostly, but the deeper you get into the app, it seems like it's driven by in-app purchases. Like, can you give me kind of like the business? Because right now we're in this period of AI
Sure.
software and I guess emergent hardware, where everyone is kind of like looking for their business model. So, can you? What's your outline for your business model? Like, how do you guys plan to actually become, you know, a profitable company?
Yeah. So we're not profitable yet, though we did grow almost 10x in 2023.
You guys have like a 4.5 rating on the
4.
iOS.
4.9 actually.
4.9. I'm sorry. Actually, no, you're absolutely right. I'm sorry. I downgraded you.
No, that's
4.9,
okay. I think we
which
deserve
is
the 4.5, but
no, but
we're also
4.9 is insane. That's insane.
yeah.
Like you
And I
rarely
also
see
think
that rating.
I think the product is still at like 2 out of 100. Like there's so much more we can do, and the reason is that it's so hard to build an AI that actually creates a great experience and engaging and personalized and retaining experience over a very long horizon. And that's what you need to do in vertical or in consumer AI, right? Because if you just come and it's not proactive, especially if you don't speak the language, and it doesn't drive the conversation and doesn't get you engaged or talk about what's interesting to you, and kind of adapts the level to the level that you are feeling comfortable with, or just pushes you a little bit and not too much, then you won't continue with the app. And the only way, since this is an ill posed problem, like what's a good conversation really depends on the person, really depends on his English level and what's interesting to him or to her. Then the only way you can learn it is from data. So the more data we have, the more users we have, the better we can, the better product experience or conversational journey that we can have, and the more users stay and recommend to their friends and give us a better grade. Um, so the more we grow, we can train our own models, and we can dive deeper into it because it's also not trivial how to train your models on your own data, because you cannot train on what Loora says because that's cyclical, and you cannot train on the users because they don't know English very well. So you
So
need
wait.
to,
Let's hit on that for a second. And I want to come
yeah,
back to business model, but
sure,
let's talk about open versus closed AI.
yeah,
The EU, European Union, recently agreed on the AI Act. And
yeah,
this is basically a set of guidelines. I think it's not going to go into effect until 2026. But basically, the idea is to, I guess, compel companies to be more transparent in terms of where their data is coming from,
yeah,
vetting, kind of their models in front of some council. I don't know.
yeah,
But what the big argument happening here in the States is this idea of, open source versus closed AI and people or companies training their models on data that is either in the public domain or
right,
supposedly in the public domain or arguably in the public domain and
right.
then
I
and
just saw
then
the lawsuit of the New York Times.
yeah, the New
Yeah,
York Times versus OpenAI recently, that lawsuit, and then this idea of, and this seems to be, I suspect this will become very popular in 2024, which is this idea of content companies licensing their data to AI
yeah,
companies so that they can
right.
train their models. So, I mean, where do you stand on all that? And I mean, can you disclose where you got your training data for Lura?
So for us, it's very simple. Our training data is our own data. Like when we started, we used public data sets, and when we started, there was no Chat GPT and there was no OpenAI API. So we trained our model on public data sets. We started with an open source transformer. We didn't train it on all the internet because there's no point. And then we fine tuned it on data that was relevant to us with losses that were relevant to our use case. But then as we gathered more and more data, and today, we have like tens of millions of data points, and we gather more and more every day at an increasing rate, then we just use our own data. Like there's no point in using other data. Like we use the data of the conversations of our users with Loora in order to understand what's a good conversation. Um, and the reason it's hard is because in order to understand what's a good conversation, you need to couple it with a business metric. Like, how do you know that it's a good conversation? Uh, you don't want to just imitate the conversations that you already have, like they do in the big models, right? They just train to act like the data, right? Um, or align it to some predefined notion. But we don't know what's a good conversation. And we try to guess. It's very hard because it's different for any person. So what we do is we optimize the models to be better and better on retention and on like user satisfaction, which we have in our data. Like we can say this conversation was good, the person liked it, and he came back to another lesson. This conversation was bad because they didn't come back. So we can use that in order to train our models. So we don't use like the New York Times data or Publix
Well,
data
so
sets.
well, weigh in. What do you think? Okay, so aside from Laura, like
Sure.
like do you think, let's just say, all of the information on all the conversations on Reddit, all of the
Right.
conversations on Facebook, all of the conversations just on the internet, do you think that's fair game? Do you think that is licensable?
So I think there are two discussions that should be well thought of. One is open source versus closed API, which is also a big discussion in the US right now, right? And the reason people say there shouldn't be open source is for safety reasons. I disagree, and we can discuss that. Um, and the second discussion is about IP, right? Like content rights, uh, which is a different discussion. And we can start with that. I think it's easier. In my opinion, there is an issue with AI using other people's IP. Um, because eventually a lot of what happens with for example companies like Anthropic or OpenAI is that they memorize a lot of stuff that they saw on the internet, and they kind of you know uh, retrieve it from the model's weights and say it as if it's their own, without attributing, without you know paying or giving respect to the original source of the data. It's an issue, and I think it should be dealt with. I don't think there's an easy solution, because sometimes it's hard to know if you use the like specific data. So you would need to the way we understand large language models in the moment, we don't really know to say, okay, here we memorized the New York Times, right? Or here we didn't use it. So you would need to have a model that is trained on New York Times and a model maybe is not trained on New York Times in order to be able to use it or not use it. And then do you pay subscription to the New York Times for the model? Do you do rev share? I think they just need to find a business model. The problem with it is like is happening with streaming services, that your cogs become significant, and then the current pricing for large language models, which is already expensive, might not be even possible. So you wouldn't be able to charge $20 from a person just to use the service, because you, out of those $20, you need to run the inference. Just the compute costs you, I don't know, $10 on average, and you need to pay $5 to the New York Times and $2 to whoever. So you need to find a business model that works. So I think it's a business problem. I don't think it's like a moral problem. Uh,
And this is actually part of what you're saying is behind, I guess, my prediction that we'll see the emergence of a robust and, I guess, popular alternative to something like ChatGPT, because the price, the cost associated with licensing all the data, to train the models, striking the deals, the question you talked about with references, when you ask a question to Bing or ChatGPT, and it includes like the little reference points. People have to remember that's what's happening now. What
right. That's what
happens?
it's
This
Google, right?
is yeah. This is ephemeral. What happens in a year when it's much better? Do we really expect it to have all these little reference points and links? I
Right.
don't think so. And so my prediction is that in the wild west of the internet, you'll see open source tools, AI
Right.
tools that that you won't necessarily be able to bring a lawsuit against. You won't necessarily be able to hold one single person accountable for. And at that point, then it becomes, I mean, then it becomes a very tricky legal conversation,
Right.
but it's far
It's hard to
more, it's
hard to
far
prove.
trickier.
It's hard to prove though. In certain cases, you get like exact quotes from specific sources, or I don't know if you've seen the lawsuit of Scarlett Johansson suing this company for cloning her voice. But also, by the way, the ChatGPT voice sounds a lot like Scarlett Johansson.
I think one of the problems, people are thinking that AI will replicate artists, and I think that will happen. You will have famous celebrities and singers licensed by estates and by management companies, but I think a bigger problem will be AI models that, I guess, emulate the sound and feel of, let's say, a Michael Jackson or a
Right.
Prince, but without directly copying that artist. And so I think we're kind of like in a murky area in terms of what will be coverable in terms of IP versus imitation, um, parody. And so I think this is kind of like the crux of where a lot of the argument is going in terms of, you know, humans versus AI. Can you train your model on existing work? And the idea that sweat equity of other humans who may in fact copy a human's work, or in their style, that kind of gets a pass. But when you automate that kind of, I guess, dynamic of sweat equity, it's not as clear, and I think there's growing resentment, frankly, in the creative class. Um, but I mean, I guess that kind of takes us a little bit as like further afield from Lura, in terms of like the discussion. I wanted to like one thing to go back to the business model discussion.
Sure.
Um, right now, we're kind of in an era of these purpose-built hardware devices. One comes to mind, Rabbit, which just came out at
I
CES.
saw it. Yeah.
The Humane device, the pin that you put on your lapel, and
Yeah.
I think Tab, which just I think got funding in addition to their pre-orders, which I'm sure was helpful. And the idea is that they're kind of leveraging these large language models to be, I guess, these purpose-driven AI functions. And personally, I think as long as I have a smartphone,
Right.
or even let's say something like the next generation of my AirPods.
Right. Or
Or
smart glasses like Facebook just Meta just released.
exactly,
If
you
it
know, the Ray
catches if
Bans.
it catches on this time, I don't know.
Right. Well, no,
Yeah.
they're already catching on more
Yeah.
so than the first. I feel like as long as I have that kind of stuff, I'm not sure I need a brooch or a pendant.
Right.
But I think a more realistic approach is kind of what Lura is taking, which is, do I want an AI model that is just my everything app? Or do I want something that is specifically laser focused on one task and does it better than anything else? And that's another. I feel like Laura is kind of very quietly possibly part of a trend in AI where you will see
Yeah.
these models specifically dedicated. I mean, sure, you can have your general purpose. What is
Right.
it? Like a restaurant where you get,
Right.
they do everything. But sometimes you want great steak. Sometimes you want, exquisite sushi. That's kind of like a flimsy example, but I think you
Yeah.
understand where I'm
I
going. I
I
mean,
get where you're going. I completely agree. I think there are two approaches, like in the business world, on where it's going. One approach is that there's going to be one AI to rule them all that will do everything, like OpenAI will take over, the world in that sense. And the other school of thought says that you will have like this generic AI, but if you want to have a problem solved very well with AI, then it needs to be specialized. It needs to solve that problem. And there are specific verticals or specific problems like ours where without the data or the specific vertical data that is not available to, for example, the big language models because it's data that is of the right distribution for the right users in the right use case. that without it's impossible to solve that problem, because you need to learn what is the solution. And I'll give an example from our world, but I think it's also applicable to any kind of vertical generative AI company that has proprietary data, which can become a flywheel to improve the service more and more and more, which is something a generic LLM cannot do. And it goes back to a very, I would say, basic property of this generative AI technology. And the basic property is that how do you measure what's a good product? Like, what's a good generative AI? What's a good conversation? It's an ill-posed problem, right? It really depends on, as we mentioned earlier in the conversation, the use case, the user, the problem you're trying to solve. Um, and that's measured per vertical. It's not like a general thing. There's no general good conversation. There's no general good uh, English teacher, right? Really depends on the vertical. And the only way you can learn, especially in our case, where we try to guess, like, what's the principles of a good conversation? It's very hard. The only way you can learn it is from data. And the more data you have, and it's very specific data. It's data of uh, language learner talking to an English teacher trying to improve their English. And they need to be engaged, and they need to be retained, and it needs to match their level of English. And it needs to talk about what's interesting to them. And the AI needs to sense when it needs to be proactive and when it's need to kind of let the user kind of push the conversation, because sometimes they get stuck. And there's no way to learn all those things except for learning it from your own data. And in verticals that are characterized by, I think, this kind of setting, you will have massive gains in kind of having specific verticalized AIs who are very good at what they do. And it's all comes from the fact that the general problem is not necessarily well defined, and the specific problem, is also not well defined. Like, you don't know what's a good metric. But in our case, we can see if people are retained. We can see if they're happy with the product. We can measure success. And through more sophisticated tools, and we can discuss why it's not easy. And you need, I would say, not just engineering capabilities, but really theoretical machine learning capabilities in your product team. You can actually harness this data in order to keep improving your product every day. And we doubled retention during 2023, which is something you don't usually see in consumer products. Uh, and it's just by keep training our own model on our own data. And
And
also, yeah.
remind me what's the in-app purchases component? Like, how does that?
Oh, so the business model is very straightforward right now, and I'm not sure it's the best business model for us. But since we started in consumer, we might also do B2B. We're getting approached by a lot of businesses because they have employees who want to improve their English, and they need to reach a very high level. But for consumers, I didn't think that the pay for usage is a good model. It kind of disincentivizes you people to talk a lot, and we want users to talk a lot. So we need to find a price where statistically we are not losing money, like the unit economics make sense. But we also incentivize users to use the app. I don't want someone to think every time before they want to talk English, oh, I need to pay you one more dollar. I don't think for consumers that's aligned with our interest of them improving their English. Uh, so right now we have either an annual subscription or a monthly subscription, and it's very straightforward. You get a free trial for the annual subscription. For the monthly, I don't think you get, but I'm not sure, depending on which variant. Um, and then you just pay a flat fee for a subscription, and it's on us to make sure that uh, it's pricey enough so that we can scale and have a healthy company. And on the other end, it's not too pricey, so we are fulfilling a mission and actually letting anyone who can pay for Netflix, overcome this barrier of English learning. Um,
So
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 it
I'll,
cannot, it can't be free, as opposed to like the Duolingo strategy back in the day of freemium. Here, there are significant costs. Like running those models is expensive, so we cannot give it for free. But we can give it at a price that pretty much most people can pay.
wait. What's I mean, since you brought up Duolingo again,
Sure.
what is the I guess central difference between what you guys are doing and what they're doing, not just in terms of the AI, but approach? Like, what is
Right.
stopping them from attacking you? What is your defense layer against something
Well,
like
first of all,
Duolingo?
they can attack us if they if they want. They're a big company. Um, Like there's always the question investors ask, what if Google does it? Well, it usually
Right.
doesn't happen, right? Um, so I'll start by saying that I think Duolingo is an amazing company, really an amazing company. And they have a great mission, and the product is fantastic, and their culture is fantastic, and the growth that they're showing, and everything. But they are targeting a very different audience and a very different need. So Duolingo can get you from knowing nothing to knowing a very little bit. And if you want to learn Japanese and you want to be able to say a few sentences and kind of feel like you're learning the language, then great, amazing. You want to learn Greek because you're a language hobbyist, amazing. Or maybe if you just want to do something that makes you feel good about yourself, and it's cognitive training instead of being on TikTok, but it's also as fun. That's what Duolingo does. And Luis Von said it himself many times. When you ask the Duolingo users, what would you do if you didn't have Duolingo, and the famous Sean Ellis question, uh, they say we'd spend more time on TikTok because that's kind of part of the need that it serves. When you ask our users, what would you do if you didn't have Loora, they say we'd either have no other choice or we'd go to private tutors and that also mostly depends on their socioeconomic state, right? If they can afford private tutors or not. Um, in contrast, or so for Duolingo, it's mostly for casual learners or language hobbyists who wants to kind of improve. And as evidence of it, their expansion is not so much to advanced English learning, but more to now music and beginner math and kind of stuff like that. So a lot of basic tutoring, which is also very gamified.
But
Um,
by the way, this is I think I have a better analogy than the restaurant
sure.
analogy. Um, you mentioned the question that investors often ask, what if Google does it?
Right.
And if you're studying Japanese, for example, yes, you can kind of Google a phrase, like type in the hiragana or the
Right.
kanji and try to get an answer, or you can even use Google Translate.
Right.
uh, I think most people will tell you, most language learners will tell you, at least for Japanese, Google Translate isn't great.
Right.
But there is any Japanese learner or student will tell you, well, they're probably familiar with this. It's called Jim Breen's JDict, and it's this very specialized grammar slash dictionary repository on the internet that's very, very specific to Japanese, and it gets very
Yeah.
obscure, but it gives you the
The
right
right
answer.
answer.
Yeah, and it's just very specific to Japanese. And I often get answers from it that I can't get from something like Google
That's
or
amazing. I'll
yeah,
have to
Google
check.
Translate. And
Yeah.
so that's what I'm thinking about with this. But I want to go back to something I asked you this earlier, and I don't feel like I got the full answer. You're focused
Sure.
on English, and I understand English is the lingua franca of the world,
Right.
and that's the language of
Right.
business, and it's what they speak at the UN and blah blah blah. But I mean, are there any plans to attack other languages, or are you just is it just
Sure.
English for the foreseeable
So
future?
So maybe before I answer that, I'll like finish my answer to your previous question about the difference between us and Duolingo because I think that leads to the answer to this question. So while Duolingo is kind of catering to this casual learning audience or kind of hobbyist audience that learns multiple things, the people who are like in dire need of learning English seriously and they need to become fluent in English and also in other languages. It's just that the market is smaller. How many people who are in dire need to become fluent in Japanese or in Italian? Maybe with the exception of Spanish and Chinese, those markets are not as big. Um, those people who seriously need to learn a language and become fluent, the only solution they had is private tutors or courses. And that's super expensive, a lot of friction. It's embarrassing. So what happens is either people pay thousands of dollars a year. A subscription on Cambly or Italki would cost between I think $1,700 to $4,000 a year, which is out of reach for most people. Or they just stay behind, and staying behind means lower salaries, less opportunities, um, and that's really a shame. And what we want to do is we target this those people, and we want to build a product for them. And they need a product that is less gamified. By the way, they don't care about that as much.
Wait,
It
wait,
needs
wait. I want to focus on that.
sure,
So one of the fun things for me when I use Duolingo is the gamification,
right, of course,
um, which is it's the app ecosystem kind of approach. What you seem to kind of push back against that approach. What's your
I think it's a great approach. I think gamification is wonderful, and I think in education it's also very important. I think that in Duolingo you mostly use it for the gamification and the idea that you're learning language, but not a lot of people become fluent from Duolingo. I can barely name, 5 people in the world. Um, but people who already kind of know English and really need to learn English, the gamification is something that assists them in retaining and kind of coming back for another day and becoming consistent with this habit. But it's not the main thing. They don't come just for the entertainment value. They have really serious motivation. So it needs to be a little, I think, more subtle. Um, it is existing in the product in the sense that, like in games, you need to be in flow, right? You need to not make too much effort and not too less effort. And after each lesson, and that's why we have lessons, you need to feel that you learned something. You need to get a reward. You need to feel that you advanced. You need to feel like a sense of, I won a little bit today, or I almost won today. I'll come back tomorrow and I'll do it again. And that's also gamification. But it's not the main thing in the app. It is a driver for retention, and it's important. It makes it learning easier, I think, in education in general. So I'm not against significant. I'm all for
okay?
gamification, but I think for our audience, um, what's even more important, because gamification, a lot of apps do it, and you do a lot of A/B tests and you find the the right spot. Except for maybe the level of conversation, which is a little hard to do technologically. For us, you need to have versatile, meaningful conversations that kind of vary over time and stay interesting, so you don't get stuck on talking about the same thing again and again. And we're far from perfect there. When we started, I think it was boring after a day, and now it's boring maybe after a few months. We do have users who've been using it since we started the app on a daily basis, like every day talking to Lura. But we can make it much easier and much more interesting for them by creating a conversational journey that is for them, that is deep, that kind of talks about what's interesting to them, but changes it along the way so they don't feel that they get bored. And that's a little more like automatic content generation in a sense, right? You won't go to Netflix and watch the same episode unless you're a 3-year-old like my son who watches the same Paw Patrol episode again and again and again, just because you get a reward in the end, right? You need to be engaged over time and you need to build this journey. And I think that's in a product like ours that targets this audience, that's the most important and the biggest driver of retention and also of learning.
I have two, I guess, final questions. One is,
And I hope I answered like the first question. I didn't answer your English question yet.
well, no, no, well, yeah, yeah, hit that.
So the reason we started with English is because
Well, no, no, not why you started. Why, like, we
ah
know why you started. It's
yeah,
obvious why you started. Will we ever get, because, when I think of the languages of the world, Chinese, um,
Chinese is a significant market. Yeah.
Spanish, to some degree French, not as much as before, but Chinese, Spanish, and French seem to stand out as like kind of,
So I
the big
think the
ones.
market for people who want to learn French not as a hobby is not as big. Don't catch me on the numbers, but as Spanish and Chinese, definitely not as English. We will expand to other languages for sure. I think we'll first expand to languages which are uh, a big market for serious learners or for people who need to become fluent. So Chinese and Spanish, for example. But I think a more natural expansion for us is also to expand in English with training people for example, workplace skills or specific situations. Also expanding to teaching children, which we don't do now, which is a little different, but is also a huge market, and it's very important to start speaking English early on. And I think after we do that, we will expand to other languages in the next couple of years. Uh, but I also think that startups need to be super focused, and we need to be like the best English teachers in the world. And once we do that, then we can kind of expand to do other languages.
Okay.
But that's mostly
Okay.
a business thing, right? It's not like a
Okay.
ideal.
Okay. I don't think you'll go broke focusing on English. So,
No, it's a
yeah, that's the right focus.
right.
Or I want to kind of like begin to wrap up. We already kind of touched upon AGI, the singularity, and
Yeah,
that kind of thing. I think everyone kind of agrees that there's it's difficult to divine the future and see past the myths of what's happening right now. But I want to talk about your singularity or your potential singularity as a company, as a category.
Yeah.
What happens? And I see this on the horizon, maybe not in the next year, but absolutely within the next 5 years. The universal translator. Or have you already anticipated this world where on our devices, on our glasses, whatever we're wearing, or components around us. I don't know if you're a Star Trek fan, but in Star Trek, whenever
Right.
they go to one of the Federation planets,
Yeah.
there's a seamless, frictionless
Right.
dialogue between the people because the universal translator is online and handling all the real time translation functions. I
Right.
imagine that is rapidly on the way. And I would see that as kind of your, kind of doom apocalypse moment as
Right.
a company. So I'm just
Right.
wondering, like, have you anticipated this? Are you envisioning how you'd respond to that?
So we actually had this debate before we started the company. Like, would translation kind of kill language learning or English learning? Um, we also had a discussion, and we thought of different ideas, like would machine learning kill transcription or translation, like human translation? And I think that for transcription, for example, and it still hadn't killed human transcription, but it will. Like, there's no doubt about it. Like, even on our benchmarks, the AI is doing much better than when we give it to humans, like your average human to transcribe. But when people learn English, they're not just learning the technical translation of, like, from their language to English or to Japanese. Uh, you're learning a culture. You're learning to understand how people think in English. You're learning how to express yourself. It's not just direct translation. I don't think you'll ever have like this Star Trek thing where you just direct translate and it's the same as if you were actually understanding the language. Because you need to understand cultural aspects. You need to understand the context. You need to understand phrases. You need to understand um, how do you behaving. You behave very differently in the U.S. than in Japan, for example, or in China. So
I
learning
just
language,
I have to jump
yes,
in.
not,
I
yeah,
absolutely agree with you. I'm a hardcore Star Trek fan, and so
yeah,
many times I've seen this like translator dynamic in the fictional translator dynamic in play.
We use a device called the Universal Translator. It's like an alien dictionary with hundreds of languages programmed into it. And it can learn new languages very quickly, but it doesn't always work. And when that happens, it's up to me to try to translate. I'm sure I don't have to tell you, it can be really hard sometimes. One wrong word can mean the difference between saying, take my hand or take my life.
And it absolutely, there are so many, there are some cultures where just a certain move of a head,
in India, for
or
example,
yeah, yeah, that was what I was referring to. Yeah. Or just the way in which, some Japanese people, maybe a stutter or a pause is not that they don't know what to say. It's actually part of what they are
right.
about to say. And that's very difficult to, I guess, translate, through,
You
AI.
need to understand the medium or the language that you are in order to be your best self in the situation. I don't think that this technical language translation will ever be as good because it's not the same problem you're coming to solve, right? You're coming to solve, you want to be, in a sense, when you're learning English, you want to be in English like a native English speaker. Like, you want to understand the situation, you want to understand the person, you want to understand the context, the reference, you want to react correctly. When you are learning Japanese and you're in Japan, you want to understand the subtext, you want to understand what's happening. It's not just learning like a technical translation. I think language is a lot more than that. And in that sense, I don't think it'll ever replace it. And people want to learn languages because it's not just learning language, it's learning a world. It's not like learning a coding language in a sense or a different coding language, right? You're learning a world of other human beings, and that's something that connects us. And I think that's never going away. I would give another analogy where I think it might go away. I think there is a big difference in learning a language in writing and learning a language in speaking or conversational. So, for example, when you write emails, there are cultural contexts, but it's not live, it's not online. You can stop and think, and you can have tools who kind of help you understand the context, you know, take a one sentence and explain it in like three paragraphs because you don't need to react live. So like Grammarly or like WordTune or other assistants that help you in writing. And in writing, it's more remote. You don't stand in front of a person. It's an offline thing. So maybe there, I think translation could help. Not sure, but maybe. But I think the way we're talking right now, I don't think like me not speaking English, having like a universal translator, uh, would have made this conversation a very good conversation. I think it would have been okay, better than not knowing English at all. But I would still have wanted to learn English if I need to get around the world and kind of build a career or kind of meet people and talk in their language. I don't see it replacing it. But we did have a meaningful discussion about it before starting the company.
And
Uh,
and so in that respect, I guess what you're doing is less strict language tutoring, but more culture
I
tutoring.
think it's both. I think if
Yeah,
you learn a language and you don't learn like the essence of the language and the culture and how people speak, then you don't really know the language. Like you know it on a certain level. But if I want to work, for example, in an American company, it's not enough that I just technically know how to say correct sentences in English with correct grammar. I need to understand the language and the people and how to behave. It's part of the language, um, in my opinion, at least. I do
not
understand.
trying to.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
sure. I do understand there's a distinction between the technical correctness of language and actually handling yourself in the situation. But I think for people who want to learn English, eventually their aim is not to be technically correct, it's to be able to express themselves and to
Right.
communicate with other people. And the language is the medium.
Do you see any kind of other categories that don't intersect with yours
Sure.
that you think are ripe for this approach where you use AI to kind of laser focus on just one area? Do you see any other areas where that might be some emerging interesting use cases?
So I
Again,
think,
outside of Lura.
yeah, I think even just, expanding Lura, I think tutoring at large, which is something we'll be aiming for in the future, is something that's ripe. I think in tutoring, so there's language, there's mathematics, there's history. There's a wonderful chart I saw that Sal Khan showed, I think, on a TED talk, where you
Khan
see, like,
Academy.
yeah. So he did a talk, I think, on TED or something, where he showed the difference that having a private tutor makes. And it's like two standard deviations of improvement in your like career or school or whatever. So having a private tutor for everything, I think, and it's different for English or for math or for anything, could be super beneficial. Uh, I think in medicine, like healthcare, but I do think in healthcare we're not quite there because there's an issue with factuality. I think you cannot trust the answers that you get from AI today 100%.
The
And in some,
hallucinations alone
there are
could.
yeah. In legal, by the way, I think companies like Harvey, they're vertical companies who can do very well. So I think there are other verticals where the data can be very beneficial.
It occurs to me that if AI art or image generation had been introduced instead as a kind of tutor to help,
Right.
traditional artists learn art techniques and study art history, there might have been a much different reaction. But since it kind of came to the fore as kind of like a would be or an attempted replacement, the
Right.
hostility is, on 100.
I
But yeah,
understand
this is.
that. I used to paint a lot, both sketch and in oil and a lot. And when I was young, one of my frustrations on why I eventually didn't go to art school is the fact that with a camera you can do so much better. The technical skills that you need in order to do art, they keep changing, right? Today you don't need those technical skills that we needed when we did like charcoal sketches or stuff like that in order for them to be realistic. And then you don't need the skills you needed in Photoshop in order to be an artist in that sense. And then today maybe you don't even need a camera in order to imagine something that you want to create. um, I think the essence of art is actually in the idea and thinking what you want to create and kind of building it. And the technical skills are, and I'm a big fan of technical skills, but they're just technical skills that enable you to do something.
Well,
So being an artist will be the same thing, just for different technical skills, I think, or maybe easier to kind of generate bigger ideas.
Well, since you went there, as a computer scientist, I have to ask you,
Sure.
Do you apply that same reasoning to
Coding.
coding?
Yeah,
Like, do you at some point do you
definitely.
feel that hard coding skills will basically, kind of, I guess,
I think
be obsolete, and you'll have to, it will be more up to the people who have interesting ideas, who understand the code but aren't necessarily coding.
I yeah, 100%. I think
Okay.
that if you look at the history of coding, even with languages, it really changed, right? When you used assembly, like, or machine language, which I used to know when I was younger, it's very hard to write something meaningful. It would take like a century to write a piece of code that does anything. But then you have higher level languages like Python or Ruby or whatever, which allow you, in something that is not very different from English, to create amazing things. And I think with AI, we'll get closer and closer to natural language. And even today, like my team, when they program something, they don't need to write as much boilerplate code. They go to Copilot, and a lot of the code is already generated, but they need to understand what they want to build. So the product skills, or the formalizing the problem or understanding what you want to build, I think becomes more and more important. And the specific nuance of this language or another language will be less and less important.
And I think we're in a very pivotal time right now because, as you just mentioned, like, someone who does know how to code
Right,
is the person who will be able to identify errors, hallucinations. And I think the
right,
same holds true for writing and visual art. If you're a traditionally trained artist or writer, you can quickly see, oh, well, that makes no sense, or that's poorly, thrust into that area, and you can kind of almost, I guess, curate slash edit the
right,
work. And I think the concern for some people, though, is, what happens, because none of this is static. So what
right.
happens when this advances to the point where not as much curation and editing is needed? Then what?
So I think then the skills that will be needed are, well, the core skills, which are defining the problem, defining the solution, defining what you want us the experience to be in a way that's clear, that's creates a good, if you do product, good experience for your users, understanding product in a sense. And that will be the work. The work wouldn't be to translate this into like machine language. It will be to define the experience, which is, well, my job today in a sense. I don't train the models myself anymore, unfortunately, although I really love it. And I think in art, it's the same, right? You will want to, today, to just make something that looks like a photo, you don't need to be an artist anymore, right? But back way then, that was like the skill. The skill was drawing something realistic. And now that's not interesting if you can do or not do. What's interesting is what you choose to draw or what you choose to create. And I think that will be the main skill. And also in writing, so you can have, your various AIs who write different things, but the key thing is like, what do you want to express? What do you want? What's the story you want to tell? That won't come from the AI, right? You need to decide what you want to, what's the story you want to tell. Um, and I think that's always going to be the thing in those
Wait,
problems.
do you? Do you?
Yeah, I do. And I
How
think,
long? Wait, what happens when we are 10 years ahead from where we're at now, and we have, not just AGI, but we're, tickling the edges of super
well,
intelligence.
AGI is not something that is very well defined. Like, what's
Well,
AGI?
yeah, we don't, let's not even put a definition on it.
Yeah,
Let's just say something that, to the human interaction, the average human
yeah.
interacting with it, they have
Appear like a
great,
human,
they have great difficulty
right?
determining whether or not, it's far beyond any Turing
Sure,
test.
like a
They
Turing.
have,
Yeah,
no, far beyond any Turing test. They
yeah,
have great difficulty determining whether or not this is a person with feelings and a
right,
backstory, and and a rough and tumble upbringing,
right.
like, and
Yeah,
I mean, we have friends that, in some cases, we generally or primarily interact with via text.
a
So
lot of friends. Yeah,
yeah, so I mean, so what, I mean, so
but it's a different question. There are two questions here. One is like, what will be the difference between interacting with an AI and interacting with a person? And I think at some point, maybe no difference for some people,
hmm.
unless you have the in-person thing, which I think is still very important. I think we need to be outside. We need to meet people in real life. I think it's super important for us as humans. and I don't see AI replacing it in the next 10 years or 20 years. Beyond that, I don't know.
You,
But
you 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 mentioned your son is 3.
yeah,
When your son is 10, 12 years old, maybe
right.
you'll have this conversation earlier. Will you advise your son to enter the field of programming, software development,
That's a
art,
question.
music?
I don't know.
Like, what could
It's
you like? Because you sound optimistic, but as someone with a young child, I'm curious. Like, what would you like as you look out into kind of like the next couple of
right.
decades? How
So I
would you
think,
what how would you prepare? What equipment would you give your child to prepare for that?
first of all, I think it's a very tough question. Like the world is changing rapidly, and I think what are the technical skills that will be required is unclear. I do think that there are skills that are in a sense, non-technical, which is what I started talking about before when I said it's two different problems. So separating or differentiating between interacting with a machine or a person, that's one problem. Like the second problem is like if everything is so easy, you want to create something and it's so easy, you don't need technical skills, then what's the purpose, right? What's the skills that you need? In my opinion, the skills that you need is to know what you want to create. Like you need imagination. And because now that's what's left, right? You need to be a product person or you need to be an artist. You can do whatever you want. Now you need to decide what you want to create that will bring value to the world or value to people around you or joy to yourself, by the way. I love music. I'm a terrible singer and I'm a terrible musician. I don't play because you know it brings value to someone else. I play because I find joy in in playing music or singing or listening to music, right? So I think those skills of creation, of deciding what you want to create, what you think will bring value, and using AI as the technical tool to do that, that will be the skill. What does that define as skills? I think critical thinking, I think physics and mathematics are always great skills.
Hold on, I don't think I was specific enough. I'm saying if you're trying to equip your child with
For the future.
the the future to take care of him or herself.
Right.
So I'm not saying just simply,
Oh,
interacting with AI. I'm saying building your life, assuming we don't have universal basic income
right.
and assuming that, you've been a good dad and you said, well, yeah, I'm wealthy now, but you can't, you're going to go
I'm not,
build your
I'm
thing.
not, I'm not that wealthy yet. Um,
um, you know,
um,
how does it, what tools do you give
yeah,
him or
I
her,
understand the question. I started by answering like the previous question of like what skills are important, I think. And I think that translates to this question. I think the skills are important is to understanding how to create value, like what's in, and that requires like those very basic skills, I think, in a sense. So critical thinking, logic, um, analytical skills, I think are very important. So my son, if he's like me, he'll be like, mathematically inclined. So, and if he's like his mom, he'll be artistically inclined, or a combination. So if he's inclined, for example, to like mathematics or sciences, I would push him to learn like those basic sciences. I think learning mathematics and learning physics helps you think about anything and can really give you those skills to kind of solve how to solve problems, no matter what's the medium. What is a specific profession that I would learn him learn? It's a great question. I'm not sure that computer science is learned today or coding. And there's a difference between computer science and coding. I think computer science, like the principles that you learn on how to address and how to solve problems and how to think of problems, will be relevant. Coding, maybe not. Probably, in 10 years, probably not.
gotcha.
Just like learning how Python or learning, C++. That's probably not relevant. Um,
Okay. So you're optimistic.
I am optimistic. Well, I think in nature, first of all, always careful but optimistic. Um, but yeah, I think in general, if you look at history, technology, in most cases, has improved our lives and kind of helped equate people and kind of help people with less means to kind of rise above the cards that they were dealt or kind of use the cards into a better future. going back to what we said earlier, I think we need to be careful that AI is not super concentrated in the hands of a few, kind of not allowing everyone to have the same opportunities. And I think that's a big risk with AI. Like if that will be something that is just for the wealthy or just for the rich or just for a few companies and not within reach for everyone, that could create inequality and kind of less equality of opportunity. And that will be risky.
Agreed. You know, I'm thinking about some of the, I guess, legal battles happening right now. Particularly, I'm thinking about the visual artists, and I'm thinking, you know, right now, I think their intent is pure and correctly motivated in that they're trying to, protect traditional
Right.
artists. But what happens if, okay, some deal is struck, some law is, initialized, where okay, now suddenly, the only this is, I don't think this will happen, but let's just say hypothetically, suddenly the only places that can generate visuals
Is
using
the big
AI
company.
are
Right.
these giant companies or companies that have a lot of money, and the only thing you can use to generate AI imagery are not just open source tools, but maybe in some cases poorly designed open source
Right.
tools that don't give you great results. That is actually taking the power further away
Away from the people.
from
Right.
independent artists. So there's an ironic or a potentially ironic outcome there if not handled
Right. And
correctly.
I think we need to be careful about that. That actually, I think, not maybe that's this specific scenario, but a scenario where AI is concentrated due to regulatory capture in the hands of a few, and kind of only gives opportunity to ones who are there in those groups. I think that's a bad future, and I don't think we want to go there. I think we want to be having AI kind of empowering everyone, kind of giving everyone the ability to express themselves, their ideas, to create stuff, to build stuff, um, and that would be a good future, I think.
Okay,
Uh,
well, Roy Mor, the co-founder and
yeah,
CEO of Loora, just remind everyone how they can access the app and in its various forms.
sure. We are now on the App Store. You can just look for Loora, Loora. Download it and subscribe. Um, and we will be in Android soon. We're not there yet.
And you can also go to Loora.ai.
Right. You can go, and there's also a link to the app.
And for our part, you can go to the 100 Year podcast, or rather, you can go to 100year.com to check out previous episodes of the podcast. You can check out our newsletter, The 100 Year Lens, which is at 100year.substack.com. And if you're not watching us, you can listen to us on Spotify, Apple, and your favorite podcast hosting app, as well as YouTube, where if you're on YouTube, please give us a like and a subscribe. We'd really appreciate it. Thanks again, Roy. This has been the 100 Year Podcast, and we will see you next time.